It's a pleasure to welcome you to the new school. The new school is an evening institution, and I'm delighted that so many of you could make it this morning at 10 o'clock. This is the third and last lecture in the series by Dr. Marcuse, and I'm delighted to present him to you now. Dr. Marcuse.
Today I would like to discuss with you some highly speculative remarks on art and the role of art in the Cultural Revolution. If I speak of art, I would like to emphasize that from the beginning. I mean the visual arts as well as music and literature, the generic term. Now, my remarks again, I'm afraid, will leave you correctly in a position where you will ask, what are we supposed to do about it? And I can only say what I said before, that a theory, and especially critical theory, cannot give any direct recipes for action. And still we can say, and it has been said by people who knew what they were talking about, that without theoretical guidance, practice, and especially political practice, is bound to fail. I am going to talk about the role of art in the Cultural Revolution, that is to say, as a potential or actual weapon in helping bringing about revolution. And I would like to start by saying that I think the term Cultural Revolution, as far as the West is concerned, it is entirely different in China. And I'm talking about the Cultural Revolution in the West, especially here in our own country. This expression is the sign of an embarrassment. Cultural Revolution, because obviously we are not in the middle of a political and economic upheaval, and still we are witnessing the all but collapse of many of the most cherished traditional cultural values. But whereas Cultural Revolution is on the one side an expression of an embarrassment, it is on the other side something very positive, namely it is expressive of the fact that social change today is of a total character, engulfing the entire society in all its dimensions, including, and perhaps today primarily including, non-material needs and values. And this total character of the upheaval going on before our eyes is first of all a problem of communication. The radical social change in process today calls for a new effective communication. It calls for a language, it calls for images capable of transmitting the rupture with the entire traditional culture. That is to say, in more technical terms, it calls for a non-reified, non-petrified language capable of withstanding the cooptive as well as suppressive powers of the establishment, a radically non-conformist language. A language which is not, as all traditional language is, not in its very substance and structure, shaped by and subjected to the requirements of the establishment. Now obviously such a radically non-conformist language cannot simply be invented. Language is nothing artificial that can be arbitrarily or not arbitrarily changed unless such change is in turn rooted in a massive objective base, in objective tendency. Such a language cannot be invented, and it doesn't have to be invented because it exists. And it exists primarily in the domain of the arts, in literature, music, and the visual arts. And the historical task is to activate this radical potential which has been blocked, which has been turned to a great extent into a conformist medium by the established bourgeois culture. The aim of the Cultural Revolution in this respect is the desublimation of culture. The desublimation of culture, meaning undoing the illusory, idealistic, harmonizing quality of art, its transfiguration of the miserable reality, or in other words, the Cultural Revolution wants to undo the divorce of art from real life. And the Cultural Revolution sees the expression of these conformist, unreal, illusory qualities of traditional art in the aesthetic form. In the aesthetic form, I would like to point out, of course, that in this context I use the term aesthetic as it has come to be used, namely as the specific quality of art and not of sensibility in general. Now, this conformist character of art is supposed to be expressed in the aesthetic form, which imposes on art an order of its own, a truth of its own, preventing art from conveying the full reality of the human condition, preventing art from really contributing to the struggle for radical change. Now, instead of this traditional art, which is supposed to be essentially conformist, instead the Cultural Revolution wants to develop an immediate, sensuous, living culture which responds to and which activates not only the intellect, not only a refined, distilled, elitist sensibility, but rather activates and moves the body and the soul, moves the body and the soul not as vehicles of labor power and its recreation, not as vehicles of renunciation and repression in the interest of an exploitative society, but moves body and soul as vehicles of liberation. And inasmuch as the sublimating aesthetic qualities are at the very roots of bourgeois culture, the Cultural Revolution attacks this culture as a whole in its very roots. Now we have to ask the question, what is bourgeois culture? Because we cannot, from the beginning to the end, fall victim to a cliché if it turns out to be a cliché that is no longer livable. I would like to suggest that while the bourgeoisie is still the ruling class, its culture is no longer that of its historical predecessors, if it has any culture at all. It is neither the culture of its predecessors, neither in the material sphere, nor in the so-called higher culture. Why not? If we look at the material culture today, where is that economic asceticism, Max Weber's inner-worldly asceticism, which has been characteristic of the traditional previous material culture of capitalism? Where is the taboo on spending, on consumption, on conspicuous consumption in the so-called consumer society? What has happened to the moral puritanism, which really or allegedly motivated the earlier stages of capitalism? What has happened to free individual enterprise? What has happened to free competition? They are no longer realities. And in the so-called higher culture of the bourgeoisie, we see what we have discussed before, the ingression into the establishment of pop art, rock festivals, the living theater, so-called pornography, sex as status symbol, commodity, all things which are in blatant contradiction to previous stages of bourgeois culture. Thus, we seem to be confronted with a very paradoxical phenomenon. Namely, the traditional bourgeois culture is rejected by the establishment, and it survives in the establishment still only as a lie, as hypocrisy, as ritualized performance. Now, when this is the case, the question must be asked, how can the cultural revolution sustain itself by developing its own nonconformist culture when its anti-culture itself is threatening to become a subculture of the establishment? And I propose to prepare a very preliminary answer that in order to prepare the soil for a radical reversal of the repressive tendencies in the cultural tradition, the movement would have to recapture and restructure the authentically nonconformist, liberating qualities of traditional art. Are there such qualities? And if so, what are they? I would like to draw your attention first on a well-known phenomenon, which, however, I think has not been sufficiently emphasized, namely that a thoroughly anti-bourgeois stance permeates the entire art, literature, and music of the bourgeois culture. It is explicit in the representative literature of the bourgeois period. In all of them, you find a strict dissociation from the world of commodities, of the market, of commerce, the indictment of this world. You find in the representative literature of the period the indictment of bourgeois materialism and bourgeois greed. You find the dissociation from the indictment of the distortion of all human relationships in bourgeois society. And this is expressed negatively. I will try to explain it subsequently. This dissociation, this critical dissociation from the bourgeois reality, is expressed in the contemplative character of classical and romantic music, in the so-called Innerlichkeit, I don't know of an English translation, the internal sensitivity and sensibility of the subject, which is supposed to be the achievement of classical and romantic music, and it is expressed in its own language as against the language spoken in the material world. This is the literature in which men and women dare to live and to die for their passion, for their love, and for their hatred. Far from being merely the sublimation of the free economic subject of the bourgeois reality. The subject as it appears in the authentic art of this period is the rejection of the economic subject. The higher culture of the bourgeois period thus contains a methodical contradiction to the bourgeois reality of the period. However, and this is of course the decisive point, a contradiction or a negation which is never direct, never immediate, but which is always broken, internalized, sublimated by the aesthetic form. Now it is this aesthetic form in which, in my view, the nonconformist elements of traditional art are contained in the literal sense of confined. It is this aesthetic form which is attacked, which is supposed to be shattered in order to make way for a new liberating culture, for creative works which express and which can express the unsublimated reality, and which may appeal, works which may appeal to a consciousness and sensibility willing to change the established reality. Let me try to sum up the principal counts of the indictment of the aesthetic form in the Cultural Revolution. It is said that the aesthetic form creates a world of beautiful illusion, that it creates an artistic, that is to say synthetic and unreal harmony and order in the midst of conflict and disorder, that it champions a poetic justice which glorifies and reconciles with the miserable reality. And this illusory fulfillment, this reconciling aesthetic pleasure, turns into a resigned affirmation of the social order. Consequently, repression of the rebellious energy of the life instincts, repression of the liberating destruction that would precede radical social change, and inasmuch as this kind of repression is inherent in the very form, aesthetic form of traditional art, art becomes a factor of stabilization, adjustment, renunciation. Art indeed has functioned as what Aristotle called the catharsis. Art had in the tradition a therapeutic function, a cure. But the cure, the therapy, is false. Mind and body were supposed to be cured, purged, precisely from those disturbing energies which rebel against massive reconciliation and adjustment. By virtue of this therapy, man forgets what is done to him and what he can do against it. And in this therapy, eliminating all the truly rebellious energies of the life instincts, by virtue of this therapy, he can find comfort in a higher order, comfort in a so-called higher truth, which turn out to be unreal. I would like to read to you words that were spoken by Herbert long before the present Cultural Revolution at the first International Surrealist Congress in London in the 30s. There he said, and I quote, "Let it be stated without further preface, classicism represents for us now and has always represented the forces of oppression. Classicism is the intellectual counterpart of political tyranny. The norms of classicism are the typical patterns of order, proportion, symmetry, equilibrium, harmony, and all of those are static and inorganic qualities. They are intellectual concepts which control and repress the vital instincts on which growth and therefore change depend. You will see to what extent these words foreshadow and anticipate what is said today. Again and again you read in the radical and especially underground press the accusation of the traditional art as repressive, the life instincts. In many cases you read clearer as repressing the sexual and erotic energies of man. I must make a personal remark here. I remember with great delight a skit, I think by Nichols and May, of two young people lying in bed together and listening to Bach and having a hell of a good time by listening to it. I personally could never understand why this kind of music, or if it is not Bach, let's say Beethoven, which is most frequently quoted, is repressive of sexual energy. And I remember that Tolstoy, who knew something about sexuality, saw in Beethoven's Kreutzer Sonata one of the most erotic and one of the most stimulating pieces in music. But I leave the decision to you, and I want to go back to Herbert Reed's word. The affirmative character, the conformist character of art exists. The question is where, and whether it resides in the aesthetic form, and whether the aesthetic form is essentially repressive today. I would like to offer two hypotheses. First, the artistic destruction of the aesthetic form is historically premature and inadequate, vicarious revolt based on a false evaluation of the present situation. And secondly, the artistic destruction of the aesthetic form is self-defeating. It cannot attain what it wants to attain. And I want to discuss briefly these two hypotheses. First, what is the aesthetic form? Of course, I cannot go here into any really adequate analysis, so it must suffice to say that the aesthetic form is, in my view, one of the lasting expressions of the social contradiction between the potential and the actual. The contradiction between the potential and the actual. And the language and images of art communicate that which is not yet communicable in reality. Language and images which may reveal an otherwise inexpressible and invisible truth. That which is as it really is, and that which could be, and which ought to be. How can this contradiction, which, as you will see, is in its very essence nonconformist, how can this contradiction be communicated in the aesthetic form? Reed mentions as its primary qualities order, proportion, harmony, and so on. They are indeed essential qualities of the aesthetic forms, but they are neither, as he maintains, intellectual concepts, nor do they, as I suggest, represent the forces of oppression. Rather the opposite is the case. Order, proportion, and harmony as qualities of the aesthetic form invoke the pattern of a liberated world where the forces of oppression are bound. The aesthetic form indeed creates order out of disorder, but this order condemns the profound disorder of the established reality, and its central quality, the central quality of this aesthetic order, is that of the beautiful, the non-violent, the coming to rest, the fulfillment. With all these qualities, the aesthetic order is a very negation of the established one. It is not the order that is represented by the forces of oppression, but much rather the order of which all the romantic characters of traditional art and literature dream. It is the order that would prevail in the land of Mignon. It is the order that would prevail in the land of Tristan. It is the order of Baudelaire's Invitation au Voyage. It is the order of the landscapes of Claude Lorraine, of Cézanne, of Monet. Now, to be sure, there is still another order represented and presented in art and also given in the aesthetic form, namely the order which subject men and women and things to the raison d'etat, to the law of the community, to the moral standards of a repressive society. The order which demands resignation, control of the vital instincts, repressive sublimation. It is this order which triumphs over Hamlet, over Lear, over Shylock, which triumphs over Romeo and Juliet, Don Juan, Violetta, Berenice, over Madame Bovary, over Julien Sorel. This is the repressive order which is indicted in these works of art. And even where the allegedly impartial justice of the oeuvre absolves the established reality and glorifies the right of this reality to destroy the rebels and outcasts and offenders, the aesthetic form itself denies this impartiality. I think it is safe to say, and I hope you can correct me if I am wrong, that in the authentic works of art, no matter who wins, the final right, the truth, is in the passion and sensibility of the victims of the established order, of the outcasts, of the defenders, and not of their executioner. And the rationality prevailing in these works is not the rationality of the oppressors, which is that of the established order. I can give you offhand only two familiar examples. If I see correctly, the only real human being in Balzac's Illusion perdue is the whore Esther. And in Verdi's La Traviata, it is not the repressive father figure representing the established order, but it is the prostitute Violetta that is allowed to think one of Verdi's most passionate and beautiful music. That is the denial of the poetic justice in the aesthetic form itself. To be sure, the aesthetic transformation of reality is an imaginary translation only, and it must be imaginary because as long as human freedom and fulfillment have not become real, only the imagination can project and make visible that which is not yet. In art, in authentic art, imagination becomes a subversive force. And I believe that this subversive force is inherent in art. Now, what is the conclusion of this brief analysis? If I'm right in what I'm suggesting, it would follow that art can fulfill its negating subversive function only as art, only through the aesthetic form itself. The political quality of art is nothing extraneous to art, and it can come to fruition only if art remains art, that is to say, remains alienated, dissociated from the established reality. A few remarks in explanation of this utterly reactionary thesis. I'm fully aware of it, and it wasn't really, for me, rather painful to work on it and to present it. I introduced the topic tonight by pointing to the problem of communication, namely to find words, tones, images capable of making the given reality appear in the light of its necessary negation. In order to be able to show that which is in the light of that which is not yet, and show it not in abstract concepts, intellectual concepts, show it not through a sociological or psychological analysis, but show it immediately in a sensuous form, intuitive. In becoming components of the aesthetic form, that is to say the poem, the novel, the painting, the composition, in becoming components of the aesthetic form, words, sounds, shapes, colors are insulated against their familiar use and function. This is a great achievement of the style. Words, sounds, shapes, etc. become transparent and transcendent. They open up a new and other dimension where the indictment and the hope, the joy and the sorrow of the human condition find their most authentic expression. But what then is the relation between art and revolution? If the subversive potential of art lies in its dissociation from and transcendence of the established reality, then it would follow that art itself can never become part of revolutionary practice. Then art could be revolutionary only through a revolution of the aesthetic form itself. Let me quote again, and this time in corroboration of what I said, what one of the most radical writers of our period, who certainly wanted to place art in the service of revolution, what André Breton said with respect to Courbet and with respect to Rimbaud. Both were directly involved in the Paris Commune of 1871. Courbet was fighting on the streets of Paris. He was present when the Vendôme column was overthrown. He risked his life in the actual struggle. And yet, there is no direct testimony of the revolution in his paintings. There is no direct political content. I'm quoting now Breton himself. Everything happens as if Courbet had decided that there must be some way to reflect his profound faith in the betterment of the world in everything that he tried to evoke. Some way to make it appear somehow in the light he caused to fall on the horizon or on a roebuck's belly. End quote. And similarly with Rimbaud. He too stands on the barricades. He fights during the Commune. He drafts a constitution for a communist society. And yet, the tenor of his 4 poems, written immediately under the impact of the Commune, in no way differs from that of the other poems he had written before. Which means, according to Breton, that the revolution was in his poetry from the beginning and to the end, as a, I quote, preoccupation of a technical order, namely to translate the world into a new language. The political engagement thus would become a problem of artistic technique, and instead of translating art into reality, reality is translated into a new aesthetic form. The radical refusal, the protest against reality, appears in the way in which words are grouped and regrouped, freed from their familiar use and abuse. Alchemy of the world, of the image, the sound, creation of another reality, out of the existing one, permanent, imaginary revolution. Emergence of a second history within the historical continuum, permanent aesthetic subversion. That seems is the permanent way of art. Now, I'm sorry, I will have to ask you for patience another, I promise not more than 10 minutes. I have to shorten it anyway, but at least it interests me, I can't help it. The question I want to ask now is, has the historical development today reached a stage where the revolution of the aesthetic form can come to an end and can be followed by the destruction of the aesthetic alienation, by the living union of art and reality? Now, there was a time between the 2 world wars where the protest seemed to be directly translatable into action, joined to action, where the shattering of the aesthetic form seemed to be the response, the adequate response to the revolutionary forces in action. Then, as the societies of the West were subjected to the global counter-revolution, as the labor movement suffered total defeat, a defeat from which it did not recover until today, at the time when the Moscow trials began, at precisely this time, Antonin Artaud formulated the program for the abolition of art. En finir avec les chefs-d'œuvre. Art must become the concern of the masses, la foule. Art must be an affair of the streets, and above all of the organism, the body of nature. Thus it would move men, would move things, for il faut que les choses crèvent pour repartir et recommencer. And Artaud explains the physical force of art. I remind you again that was written in the early 30s. He refers to the serpent, and he says, I quote, "The serpent moves to the tone of the music, not because of the spiritual content of the music, but because the vibrations communicate themselves through the soil to the serpent's entire body. Art has cut off this physical communication and deprived motion from the repercussion in the organism. This unity with nature must be restored. Beneath the poetry of texts, there is poetry tout court, without form and without text. This natural poetry must be recaptured, which is still present in the eternal myth of mankind, such as beneath the text in Sophocles' Oedipus and in the magic of the primitives. Its liberation is prerequisite for the liberation of the human being itself. For we are not free, and the sky can still fall on our head. And the theater is made first of all in order to teach us all this." End quote. To attain this goal, Artaud thought, the theater must leave the stage and go on the street to the masses. And it must shock, cruelly shock, and shatter the complacent consciousness and the complacent unconscious. I quote again Artaud. He wants a theater where violent physical images crush and hypnotize the sensibility of the spectator, seized in the theater like by a whirlwind of superior forces. End quote. Now, already when Artaud wrote, the superior force was of a very different kind than he imagined, and this superior force seized man not to liberate, but rather to enslave and destroy him more effectively. It was the beginning of the fascist era. And today, what possible language, what possible image can crush and hypnotize minds and bodies who have learned to live in peaceful and very tolerable coexistence, even profiting coexistence with genocide, torture, prison, insane asylums, and so on. And if Artaud wants a constant sonorization, sounds and noises and cries, first for their quality of vibration, and then for that which they represent, we ask today, has not the audience, any audience, even the natural audience of the streets, long since become familiar with the violent noises, cries, which are daily equipment of the mass media and of reality, the daily equipment of sports, of the highways, the places of recreation? Violent noises can no longer break the oppressive familiarity with destruction. If, again, that is the case, it seems that even Artaud's most radical exhortation for a living art is no longer sufficient. And I want to suggest at the end, and now really the end, that the bridging of the gap between art and the people, between the theater and the street, can only be the result of political action and political education, but that in the meantime art has to find its own way of subverting the aesthetic form and creating a new form. The talk of the end of art, the abolition of art, is today even more widespread than at the time Artaud wrote. I believe it is only when men have come to see through the established societies, when they are seized, indeed, physically and intellectually, by the magnitude of the crimes and by the possibilities literally at hand to stop these crimes, that they set out to build a better world. And then they will come to grips with the necessity of art, still the dire necessity of art in both its historical forms, those of the tradition recaptured, and those of the new modes and means of creation. The twofold liberation of the human being and of nature would then create a universe common to art and reality, but in this common universe, art would retain its transcendence. In all likelihood, even in the freest of all societies, people will not go around composing music and speaking poetry. That would be horrible. They will still talk prose. The end of art is really conceivable only if men are no longer capable of distinguishing between true and false, between good and evil, between beautiful and ugly, between the possible and the real. And this would indeed be the state of perfect barbarism at the height of civilization. And such a state is, I'm afraid, a real possibility. Thank you.